excited to welcome everyone here to listen into how to troubleshoot VMware Horizon is slow, even when the problem is not VMware. I'm equally excited and honored to have our VMware vExpert, Johan van Amersfoort, with us today, who I'll introduce to you in a bit more in a minute. We also have our senior technical consultant here at Goliath, Yemi Ladyju. Now, before we jump in, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items and set expectations. Johan is going to talk about some of the challenges he sees organizations face while trying to deliver high-performing end-user experience to their users in this virtualized environment with VMware Horizon. I'm then just going to give one short overview slide on who Goliath is to help set context. And from there, Johan and Yemi are going to walk through 3 specific customer examples around slow logon time, slow session performance, and actually something we see quite often, which is a brand new VMware Horizon deployment moving from Citrix to VMware. And we're going to show a demonstration on how through these 3 scenarios, you can more effectively monitor and troubleshoot end user performance experience issues. The webinar itself will run about 30 to 45 minutes. We'll have Q&A at the end, so please include them in the questions. At the end of this, we will have a short 4-question survey. It should take you less than 90 seconds to complete. Please take the time to do that, because based on this feedback, we can continually improve the content we're providing to you, our community. And finally, we always get this question. You will receive a copy of this webinar in your inbox within the next 24 hours. So absolutely can have that recording. Now with that, let me introduce you to Johan. Johan is a technologist for end-user computing and AI working for ITQ Consultancy. Here he is responsible for the overall technology strategy as he looks at the markets for end-user computing and artificial intelligence. In 2018, he released the VDI Design Guide, which describes the complete process of designing a VDI based on modern standards. He is also heavily involved in multiple EUC communities, such as vExpert, VMware EUC Champion, and NVIDIA NGCA. He's one of the 20 VMware certified design experts globally around desktop and mobility. As I've mentioned, he really specializes in VDI, graphical acceleration with GPUs, and modern AI platforms for deep learning. So furthermore, you can often find him talking on these topics around vMugs, UserCons, and VMworld and VMware EUC TechCon. So as you can see, I am extremely excited to have his expertise on here and really talk through some of these challenges that he sees as he meets with organizations on a daily basis. So again, please make sure you get your Q&A in here. It is rare to have such an opportunity with someone that has such deep expertise in the market as well as the technology. So Johan, thank you again for joining us today. And why don't you give us a little bit of the background?
Thank you, Stacy, for an awesome introduction. Yeah, so I would like to dive into a couple of challenges that I, as a consultant technologist, on a regular basis see at customers. And those 4 challenges in this case are linked to a hybrid infrastructure, mostly remote users, dependencies in general, and new initiatives. But let's start in the hybrid infrastructure, because a VDI for many years was facing or was created to have a remote user linked to a or connecting towards an on-prem data center with desktops, but we're more or less seeing a migration or a strategy that is not only just bound to an on-prem infrastructure. Many customers are consuming services from the cloud, and it's quite logical to have your desktops near that cloud as well. So having a visuality or having insights on what's happening on-prem as well as in the cloud is really important. Next to that, we're seeing that users are kind of changing. So, up till 10 years ago or 5 years ago, a user was someone with a thin client when they were connecting from the office. Sometimes if they were remote, they used a laptop, and all of those devices were managed over by IT. But nowadays we see that the form factor of devices is changing. Remote users in general are becoming more or less the standard. So you can basically consider everyone to be remote, and that has impact on how we manage those users as well. The third bullet, so yeah, the dependency on core applications and the rest of the infrastructure is really important, because we're seeing that if you look at EMR applications for healthcare, for instance, they are, they're really, really important, but they're not just the only component that has an impact on performance. So if an application performs not or doesn't perform that well, you can probably see that directly, but there are so much more components that could impact the performance of the application. So it's really important to have an insight in that as well. And like I mentioned, so we see that the type of that a user in how a user behaves is changing, but we're seeing also that it's quite easy to have new initiatives in your organization. For instance, if you want to change from the type of endpoint from like a Windows laptop to a Chromebook or something else, you need to be able to have insights in those changes as well, and be able to manage those types of different use cases and initiatives. And when talking about all of these different challenges, I already mentioned insights a couple of times. It's really, really, really important to have those insights in what's happening in your organization, both from a intelligence perspective. You want to reduce the amount of work you need to manage endpoints, to manage your VDI, but also to manage changes that are happening. So you need embedded intelligence and automate your monitoring solutions and your management solutions as much as possible. It's really important, like I mentioned in the previous slide, that an application itself is really good that we monitor the application, but there are so much more dependencies that need to be monitored as well, because if something in the chain changes, it could impact the user experience in general. So it's really important to have broad and deep metrics across the complete delivery of the desktop in your IT environment, and show your end user behavior not only on the infrastructure, but also some parts outside of the infrastructure, like the endpoint, like the connectivity between the endpoint and the virtual desktop, etc. And the last bullet, historic events or historic reports and analytics, is really important when looking at trends, for instance, and changes. So if you happen to have, if you're changing the environment and apply changes during the environment, it's really important to keep track of what changes and keep track of what has happened in the meantime, to see how those changes have impacted your environment as well. And it's really important to do that, just not only inside the in this case the VMware stack, but also components that have interaction with the VMware stack, such as your storage environment, your compute environment, etc.
Well, thank you, Johan. And I think you just gave a great overview of why Goliath does what we do and the type of solutions that we provide to organizations like those that you see on the screen. So I promise to just provide one slide of context as follow-up before jumping in use cases. So who is Goliath? What we do is we offer end-user experience monitoring and troubleshooting software with that embedded intelligence and automation that really enables IT pros to anticipate, troubleshoot, and prevent performance issues, regardless of where workloads, applications, or users are located. And as you can see on the screen, we do this across industries, we do this across use cases, and with all different sized organizations. We can meet the needs of these varying use cases and sizes, working with organizations that are Fortune 100 all the way down to SMBs, because of the scalability of our product and also the price point that we allow to scale to meet all the different sizes. As you can see, we do have a focus in healthcare as we have purpose-built modules for Cerner, Epic, Meditech, and Allscripts that allow us to integrate those performance metrics you discussed from the EHR applications, the end user experience and their behavior, as well as the IT delivery infrastructure, which may be VMware Horizon, to better troubleshoot when issues come up. And we can really anticipate those issues and help prevent them altogether. You mentioned, Johan, the need for that embedded intelligence and automation. This is something Goliath has really been founded on. So way back when, we actually started off really consulting and helping the end user computer area and those that were investing in virtualization. And from that, we built this years of intelligence working with our customers into the product. So when our customers hire Goliath, they often tell us it's almost as if they've hired a full-time troubleshooting expert who works 24/7, 365 days a week, requires no training, no management, and is always there, not only to help identify issues, but prevent them. With that context, I want to move in then into 3 of the scenarios we talked about. So Johan, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk a little bit why it is so challenging in today's environment to really troubleshoot and isolate root cause when end users are creating tickets around slow logon times.
Yeah, thanks. And let's focus on the first point, which I'm quite sure that most companies and most IT people within companies face these challenges. And that's logon times. Logons in general are always a challenge. If it's, if you're moving away from Windows 7, you move to Windows 10, or you have different types of applications, suddenly your logons change, and you have some challenges regarding your logon times. So if we run around every one of those bullets, the first one is something that we see, especially when moving away from an old way of managing profiles to, if customers, use VDI for the first times, they generally work with roaming profiles, which honestly I think it's a really, really bad idea, because roaming profiles tend to grow, and especially when having no quotas on those profiles, you'll see that they'll be like immensely big and slow down your logging times. The other one, if you do set a quota, you'll see that profile issues like corruption will start to occur. So roaming profiles in general are a bad idea. If you look at logon scripts, it's quite easy to forget something or to script something that impacts a certain group of desktops or a certain group of users, with the result that your logon times will increase. And with group policies, it's the same thing, especially when customers are migrating from or have worked with Active Directory for a lot of years and started out with 2000, migrated to 2003, and are finally currently at 2019. Most of those GPOs have migrated with them or are still in the AD, but they implemented new group policies. They blocked them or they didn't block them. And what you'll see eventually is that you have such a great amount of group policies being active that they slow down the logon as well. And finally, a lack of hypervisor resources or a resource constraint in general is one of the things that we see as well. It's quite easy to scale up, and obviously the return of investment is better if you have a higher density of desktops on a single host or on the platform in general. But it's really important to keep track of those resources to avoid oversaturation. And those challenges, all 4 of those challenges are directly impacting logon times and performance in general.
And Johan, I think that's really good. Thanks for setting the stage there, because those are sort of the things that we see a lot when customers are sort of leveraging the tool to troubleshoot issues with logons. So with that, I think that's a good segue into the next slide, which is going to talk about this particular customer of ours and how they were able to leverage the Goliath solution to actually troubleshoot some of the issues. So before we jump into the demonstration, I want to set the stage a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the pain points that they were experiencing. So this is a large health system. They have about 25 regional hospitals across the United States, and they're using VMware Horizon VDI, as well as leveraging or delivering an EHR application, which in this case was Epic, via some RDSH applications, sort of published applications. And with the environment, as you can imagine, based on some of the things that Johan just highlighted, they were experiencing some logon issues, particularly when it came to accessing the Epic application. And this, obviously, in a healthcare environment, was really troublesome. Number one, because obviously patients were being impacted. Patient care was being impacted. And IT didn't have sort of any visibility into all of those components that actually impact the logon process. So because of that, tickets are being opened, doctors and physicians are sort of reporting these things over to the CIO level. So there was a lot of pressure on IT to be able to solve these issues and get at least an understanding as to what portion or part of the environment was actually impacting these delays. So before I jump into how they were able to do it, I wanted to point out a couple of things. There's about 3 different, after they deployed the technology, they found about 3 different root causes of issues that were impacting those delays. The first was something that Johan mentioned, which was hypervisor or resource utilization on the hypervisor host. The other thing was they were using a wrong domain controller. And finally, they had some printer policies that were actually sort of misconfigured due to issues like upgrading a version, whether it's a version of Windows or AD versions, and those are actually impacting the session. So let's actually dive into the technology and talk about, or let me show you where they went and how they were able to identify these issues. So typically when users want to troubleshoot using the technology, they come over here, which is the VMware Horizon session display. And this is where all of the sessions in the environment automatically populate. So you can see the user's name here on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see their account, of course. What machine they connected to, what group they're in. You can see some high-level metrics here when it comes to performance and things like that. And before I dive into this, I wanted to point out that we do not average or roll up any information we collect in our technology. So this particular customer was able to sort of go back and see historic sessions as well as current sessions to really understand what's changing in the environment and how these changes are actually impacting these user sessions. So the first thing that they did was then isolate the sessions that they were actually looking for. So there's, as you can see, there are a number of different sessions across the entire environment. And they were able to sort of isolate those sessions that were being impacted by those the poor logon times. They then clicked on the session, and what they now get is a pop-up of about 7 or 8 tabs, depending on what's actually configured, showing all the information that is sort of needed to troubleshoot any issue inside of the user session. Starting off with the summary tab, and the summary tab just pulls in together some deep metrics when it comes to giving you quick answers, or it then directs you to the tab that allows you to come up with those answers. So the first thing they saw right away is when users are complaining, VMware is slow or Epic is slow, they saw, all right, it looks like they were all kind of focused or being driven by poor logon times in the environment. So they're able to see that here, flip over to the logon tab, and try to identify what's actually impacting this user session from a logon perspective. So this page breaks down each stage of the process. And depending on what you actually have configured in your environment, this is sort of dynamic and it changes and it gives you the ability to expand each of the sections. So the first thing that they noticed were sort of delays with the authentication process. While opening up authentication, what they saw was that, particularly when it came to the LDAP calls, that they was taking a lot of time. It turns out that they were using the wrong domain controller to actually authenticate sessions. So there was delays because, you know, the calls made to the domain controller had to sort of traverse the network, and that was adding a significant chunk of time to the environment. That's a quick fix, right? You can just reconfigure that logon, and they were able to fix that particular issue. The next thing that they saw was an issue with group policies. So as they opened up the group policy section, what they found was in their sort of printer mapping, they were mapping to a printer that was decommissioned. But because this section actually breaks down each individual policy down to the policy name and how long each one is taking to execute, they were able to see that in one click, identify that problem policy, remove it from the environment, and that actually cut down the times as well. So within a couple of clicks, they were able to cut down their logon times significantly just by, you know, leveraging the technology here. And then finally, for those affected sessions, they flipped over here to the hypervisor host tab, and then they were able to see sort of the host utilization for this individual user session. It was then that they were able to see, they found out that they had some legacy hardware that they needed to remove from rotation, because every user that was on that hardware, that was sort of leveraging that hardware, they were experiencing issues. How they did that was, obviously, they would take a look at resource utilization and sort of the data stores that were attached. But here they could also see all of the other VMs that were being supported by that host, which really allowed them to see, okay, well, it's not just that it's one individual user that's experiencing these sort of issues. Looks like most of the VMs that are being supported by these hosts are experiencing these issues as well. So within one single click or one single view, you're able to see all of those pieces that impact the logon and emerge with a conclusion as to what they needed to do to solve these issues. And Johan, I had a question for you. You know, in this situation where there are multiple different areas or multiple different failure points that impacted the a logon time, is that something that you see a lot in your experience, where there's not just one issue but multiple issues that impact a particular logon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this gives some great insights in those specific issues. So one being, for instance, that what we see a lot is that the ISV of a specific application advises a customer to use 8 CPU cores, for instance, but they just advise that because that's a general available number of cores on a physical machine, like a physical desktop. When sizing an application like that for a virtual environment, you basically need to know what the actual resources are that the application are using, instead of just giving a user 8 cores. And one of the things that we used the performance monitor for, or what we found out with the performance monitor, is if the hypervisor host in general, or in that case where the desktop is running on, is really, really busy, constantly calculating, and it shows normal ready times, but the virtual desktops that have too much cores allocated are basically doing nothing. It means that the host the host has too much cores that have been allocated to the VMs to schedule, basically, and the ready times for the VMs are being increased. And in the first performance graph that you showed in the demo, you had a perfect overview of the desktop in this case, or the session with normal ready times, and the ready times of the host next to it. And I think this is a really, really great view of, or a great feature of the performance monitor, because in one overview you have both your data center resources as well as your service resources, so of the Horizon service, as well as the metrics of the desktop, all in one view.
Yeah, perfect. And I think that's something that, you know, a lot of our customers really talk about too, is the ability to correlate all of those components that impact the user session. And I think the next example, I actually could talk a little bit more about, you know, why that's important, or add a little bit more detail into why that's important, especially when we're talking about in-session performance. So I think that's a good segue into this next customer scenario here, where in this case, they were having performance issues. So they were able to log into the environment, you know, relatively quickly, but because of the complexity of this workforce, you know, troubleshooting these in-session performance issues were particularly very hard without a purpose-built tool. So this was a large utility company with a large remote workforce. So users connecting in to the Horizon VDI environment using thin clients, and they were also using IP communicator soft phones within those thin clients. So not only are they accessing the environment from different areas all over the world, whether it's from their home office or whether it's from Starbucks or something like that, but they're also leveraging a soft phone within the VDI session, which then adds a lot of complexity. So obviously, when the environment's this complex and users start complaining about issues, the IT department really had no visibility and no idea how to sort of have objective conversations, whether it's with the network team, whether it's with the end users themselves, as to what's actually causing these sort of issues. And because of this, the sort of stigma or the overall perception of the environment was pretty poor, and it was getting up to management, and management was actually thinking about putting this sort of initiative on hold. That actually drove this company to reach out to us here at Goliath, and we deployed the technology, and then gave them the ability to drill into individual sessions as issues come up to actually solve these problems, or to come up with answers as to what's causing these sort of issues. So in the exact same fashion as the first company did in the first scenario, this company then took a look at the session display. And this is, again, where all of those sessions populated in their environment. They're able to identify those sessions that were actually being impacted by poor performance, poor session performance, and actually go through a troubleshooting process. So they clicked on an individual user session, similar to this particular case, and now they're able to see all the information they needed to be able to troubleshoot very quickly. Now, how they actually went through and started troubleshooting was pretty simple. On the summary tab, they looked here at round trip time, and I'm sure we're all familiar with round trip time. It's, you know, sort of the accurate depiction of whether or not this user is experiencing some sort of issue inside of their session or not. Now, this environment seems to be functioning pretty well, but imagine, you know, round trip time is about 350, 400 milliseconds for these users connecting in remotely and using their IP communicator soft phones. What they then took a look at after that was, okay, what's actually driving that high round trip time? Is it a resource utilization issue, or is it something on the network side? How they were able to come up with those answers is by taking a look here at network latency. This is real-time network latency, not the typical ICMP or ping-based network latency. But this effectively gave this company the ability to point to, you know, network performance issues that are actually impacting the session, whether it's a blast session or PC over IP session. Network performance issues, there's actually bottlenecking performance, which means that you could then rule out the VM resources or the host resources as being the root cause and focus on the network. So that network latency metric does a really good job of sort of narrowing things down, but it still doesn't give you the definitive answers. It was then that they looked at connection speed. This is the amount of bandwidth available for Citrix, or excuse me, for the Horizon client at the endpoint. What this tells you is how much bandwidth this user has, or how much connection speed they have to actually access their VDI, whether they're connecting in from their home office, whether it's a Starbucks. You can tell the bandwidth that is available to them, right? This is objective evidence, because if a user has 0.5 megabits per second connection speed, similar to what they were able to see here for these affected users connecting in from their home offices, then this user does not have enough bandwidth to actually have a responsive VDI session. So I remember they were telling us about a particular end user who was working from home starting at about 8 a.m., didn't have any issues, but then started experiencing issues within her session at about 3 p.m. Well, they flipped over to this technology, they isolated her session, they found that there was a huge drop in connection speed to about 1 megabit per second. And they asked her and that drop it started right about 3 p.m. And they asked her, what happens in your household at 3 p.m.? And she says, well, her husband comes home and he gets on the computers, and her kids get home from school and they get on Xbox. So all of these users on the environment are then pegging the connection and then causing her to have problems within her session, right? And as soon as those users got off of those sessions or got off of the internet, the connection speed went back up, and her user experience was much better, and they were able to prove that and see that in real time by looking at the session display. So because of the deep metrics here, they were able to have these objective conversations with end users and point to the actual root cause of the slowness, which ultimately gave IT presented IT in more of a favorable light, because they had the ability to point to exactly what was causing these issues. Another thing that added complexity in this environment was the use of the soft phones. So if we flip over here to the PC over IP session, and this will change obviously if it was a blast session, in this environment we have PC over IP. What they were also able to see was the different channels that were being utilized inside of the Horizon session, which was important particularly for the network team. While using IP, these IP soft phones, the network team had this amount of bandwidth in mind that they wanted to allocate for the VDI, and what they were able to find was that for sessions that didn't use the IP soft phones, everything was fine. But whenever someone would try to use their soft phone within their VDI, there were some issues. They flipped over to this section here, and this really broke out all of the available or the bandwidth types that were being used inside of the VDI. So you can see typically the imaging bandwidth is going to be very high. But what they saw is that whenever there was audio input and output bandwidth being used, that correlated with network latency, and then correlated with high round trip times for the session. So what they saw is that what that meant to the network team was that they didn't have enough bandwidth allocated for responsive sessions when utilizing those soft phones. This was objective evidence. They saw that without a doubt, and then they increased the amount of bandwidth that was going to be used inside of the VDI sessions to support their users' needs. So not only are they able to use this technology to support or to troubleshoot issues with poor connection speed at those users' endpoints, they were also able to use this to have collaborative conversations with the internal teams to be able to make sure that they're supporting the users in the right way, and ultimately save the project as a whole. So I wanted to pause for a second and maybe allow Johan to talk a little bit about some of the considerations when rolling out VDI environments.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I think the goal here, the thing with a VDI is that if you finish an initial deployment, it's never ready. So we all know that Windows 10 has a different update cadence as Windows 7 had. We all know that performance or security, for instance, is another one. Every month new security updates are released. So I think one of the things that we're seeing currently is that a VDI is a living thing. It's constantly being changed, it's constantly being updated, and it's really, really important to have insights in how the environment is running when you apply changes. And a change could be, for instance, so we're seeing currently a lot of customers migrating from Citrix virtual apps and desktops towards Horizon. And still, if a change like that is being applied, you want to have insights before and after the migration. The same thing with changing a connection protocol, or if you are applying certain security patches, you want to know what the impact of the patches is. And the thing that we always say in Dutch is it's a Dutch saying. So knowing, or measuring is knowing, which basically translates to the numbers tell the tale. And having those insights in those metrics is really important, both before as well as after you apply the change, which will obviously enable effective troubleshooting to resolve performance issues. If you change from a connection protocol, and PCO over IP is the old protocol or the first protocol that VMware used with rich graphics. They are constantly or currently working towards or adding more features to Blast Extreme, which has a feature parity with PCO over IP, but it currently also has more enhancements in terms of networking, and it's very tolerant to latency. What you want to see is when changing from PCO over IP to Blast, what the impact, for instance, is in CPU usage or in memory usage of the Blast Extreme protocol. And one of the things that Yemi just showed in the demo was there was an overview of the applications, the top 5 applications that are, for instance, using CPU resources on a virtual desktop. And if you change from one connection protocol to the other, you can actually see in that overview what's happening. So it's a really good, it gives you a really good overview of the changes you applied. And especially when, looking at your SLA and wanting to know what changes have occurred in let's say the last 12 months, it's a great, or it's almost essential to have an historical overview of your environment, in which a tool like this is essential as well.
Thank you very much, Johan. I think that's a good point, and that's also a great segue into the next and the final scenario that we have to talk about today, which was an environment or a customer that was moving from Citrix virtual apps and desktops to VMware Horizon. And the reason for the move was because they were having major issues with outages and things like that with Citrix, and the end users became apathetic and really just did not want to leverage sort of those tools anymore because of the historically poor performance. So the leadership of this particular credit union decided that the only way to get users to want to engage in the new environment or engage with the virtualization environment would be to roll out a completely new technology. So it was then that they rolled out, VMware Horizon, and because of the pain that they went through, particularly when they were supporting their former Citrix environment, they wanted to make sure that they had technology in place to alert them to issues before users are impacted, and also information to be able to understand the environment, understand any issues taking place, so that the users would not have the same experience with the new technology as they did with Citrix. So it was with that they deployed, while rolling out the new VDI environment, they deployed the portion of the Goliath technology that is typically used as an early warning system. So what's actually taking place is there's a central Goliath console that is typically deployed inside of the data center, and then they had virtual users set up at each of their different locations that users were actually leveraging or accessing these technologies. And what's actually taking place is, you have these virtual users. It's typically deployed on a laptop or VM, or let's say a physical server at each one of those locations. And from that VM or laptop, what's actually taking place is it's launching applications and desktops on a 24/7, 365 basis. So effectively, it's testing the entire environment. It's going through the firewall, and it's making sure that those VMware delivery infrastructure components are working together. It's also testing and making sure that the back-end systems that interact with this environment, they're all working together, as well as the virtualization environment, and making sure that provisioning and things like that actually are configured correctly and are available at any point in time. So these launches are taking place before users get in, maybe before heavy workload hours, or even in some cases 24/7. And if there's an issue with any step of the process or any component that actually results in resources not being available to the users, IT now got a real-time alert so they could then analyze and get ahead of these issues and solve them before users were actually impacted. They were doing this for both their legacy Citrix environment and their and the VMware environment that they were building and setting up for the new users. This now gave them the ability to baseline, understand what performance looked like, understand what availability looked like, and as well as get an early warning system to be able to get ahead of issues and get out of the business of relying on users to report these issues. Because as we all know, when users are experiencing that, a lot of issues, they tend to become apathetic, they're inconsistent. This is objective evidence to prove exactly what's taking place from an availability standpoint. It's going to take a couple of seconds just to show you what that looks like here in the technology. So this is the application availability analysis tab. And what this does is it really, it's a sort of at the top, a real-time dashboard of all the launches taking place across the entire environment. This will be for the Citrix launches, for the VMware launches, as well as RDS launches if you have that in your environment. In this case, this customer had the ability to filter based on date range and send out weekly reports to management showing, hey, this is what availability looks like for Citrix and for VMware. They're able to filter based on the locations that they're launching applications from, and even filter based on the applications and desktops that they were launching. Now, at the bottom section, this is typically where they would go when they've gotten an alert, saying that a particular resource was not able to be published, preferably before users start to report these issues, so then they can see the date and time of the launch, what applications were being launched, where they were being launched from, and if they failed, they can see at what stage they failed, so that they could actually go through and solve those issues as quickly as possible. We also gave them the ability to see screenshots of each stage of the process. So here's for a Citrix launch, but it works the same way for Horizon as well. So this particular customer was able to get objective evidence along with the early warning system to be able to make sure that resources are available to the users at any point. The next thing that they did was they leveraged the historical reporting and analytics of the technology, making sure, number one, leveraging the license usage reports, making sure that they had enough licenses or if they had enough availability of licenses to be able to onboard users in a rate that supports their needs. They had some reports for log-on duration, breaking down each stage of the process. So as they are sort of adding new policies and drive maps and things like that, they were able to see as a whole how those are affecting log-on times in not only the Citrix environment, but most importantly, the new VDI environment. And here's another one that's sort of graphically intensive. So what they were able to do is completely manage the entire VDI process with synthetic monitoring or with an early warning system. They were able to use the broad and deep metrics to be able to troubleshoot similar to the first two examples that we gave. And finally, leveraging the historical reporting and analytics so that they can make sure that the environment is functioning well as a whole. And if there are issues, they have the objective evidence to solve them and justify any fixed actions moving forward. So with that, I'll pass it over to Stacy so that we can wrap up and then handle some of the questions.
Thank you, Yemi. Thank you, Johan. And yes, please do submit your questions. We'll get to them here in just 1 minute. Now, as you saw in the last three scenarios, Goliath really offers end-user experience monitoring and troubleshooting software with that embedded intelligence that really allows you, the IT pro, to anticipate, troubleshoot, and prevent performance issues regardless of where workloads, applications, or users are located. As I mentioned earlier, our solution was built on years of intelligence gathered from consulting projects, as we discussed, in order to embed it into our product, proactively looking for events, conditions, and failure points that can lead to these end-user experience issues. So when organizations use Goliath, it is like adding a full-time employee to your staff that is dedicated to proactively identifying performance issues and troubleshooting them. Now, we do this by providing a single pane of glass with deep and broad metrics that offers end-to-end visibility across the entire end-user experience from all IT delivery infrastructure elements. And if you're in healthcare, we have those purpose-built modules for all major EHR applications like Epic, Cerner, Meditech, and Allscripts, as well as then calculating in metrics from end-user behavior. In that very story Yemi told about where bandwidth allocation was the issue because more and more people were coming at that remote location. Now, this holistic view helps organizations like yourself not only isolate the root cause, but really prevent them from happening in the future. And finally, we can not only help you measure your end user experience, as Yemi just spoke about, but we provide that historical reports and analytics that empowers you, the IT admin, to have data-driven conversations with other IT teams, upper management, vendors, as well as your end users. So much time can be spent hypothesizing about an issue, arguing whose fault is it, but when you have actual data, you can simplify the conversation and really take action, proving to all involved where you need to focus your time and effort. Before we jump into questions, and we do have a few coming in right now, I want to highlight, Yemi, the next slide. As we mentioned, Johan does have a VDI book that you can get a free copy if you come to our website, and we'll be happy to get that out to you. It really can help with the fundamentals, even if you've implemented, really identifying some of those best practices and what is the way to ensure that you're delivering that great end user experience. And with that, let's jump into a few questions that have come in. The first is, and maybe Johan, you can share some of your thoughts, and then Yemi, when troubleshooting VMware, what should I check in the ESXi host or storage, SAN and VxRail, to see if it's causing slowness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So infrastructure in general is always it's key to keep track of what's happening there. And if like I mentioned earlier, if your infrastructure isn't oversaturated. So the first thing that you would always check from the CPU perspective on a host is if ready times on the virtual machines aren't increasing. So a ready time for a virtual machine is if a virtual machine is ready to be processed, but the host isn't able to schedule those CPU calculations, it quite often means that either your host is saturated, or you have deployed too much or assigned too much virtual CPUs to a single VM. So that is definitely one to keep track of. Another one is obviously RAM. So RAM memory should never ever be over allocated to so oversized for a fixed number of virtual machines. Storage, like you mentioned, storage is key for virtual desktops to ensure that they are able to perform. And it's always, well, there's like a threshold that you need to keep track of on the storage, and that's mostly around 15 milliseconds latency. As soon as the latency starts to increase to 15 milliseconds, you're probably going to have some performance issues. So everything beneath or under the 50 milliseconds is really good. And when looking at those performance metrics, keep track of the time of the day, because a lot of our customers have what we call boot storms in the morning, and your infrastructure resources tend to become a bit more utilized in those morning moments. let's say everyone starts to boot their machines at, let's say, 8 o'clock or 8:30, or somewhere between 6 or 7:30 and 8:30. So you need to keep track of those boot storms as well.
Johan, and I think that's a good point. Effectively, there are a number of different things that you should be looking at within the ESXi host to sort of understand how that's impacting users, and how our customers leverage the technology is, we have all of that information in a single pane, so you can see it, from a user perspective, but then you can also see it from the host perspective. So all of those metrics that Johan mentioned, whereas resource utilization, CPU utilization, as well as CPU ready, memory, disk performance, and I know you mentioned disk latencies and things like that. So our customers have the ability to set threshold-based alerts on any one of these. The technology does come with some of these alerts right out of the box, and then obviously you can tweak these things on implementation, but you sort of get a single view of the overall performance of any one of the data, any one of the hosts and the data stores, and packed with embedded intelligence and automation as well, so that you could not only be alerted to these issues, but take automatic remediation actions with our alert resolution functionality. So I thought that was a good point to bring up as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Yemi. And I did get the question, is this going to be recorded and where can it be viewed? It is recorded. We will send it via email within the next 24 hours. It will also be on our YouTube channel as well as on-demand webinars on our website. So there's plenty of places that you'll be able to find it. The next question, and this might really be an add-on to what you already just shared, Johan. It's asking, how can I isolate noise or misnomers during RCA to trend out the actual cause? And then kind of follow up the same person had, can I use this tool to easily prove if it's protocol versus application slowness? So maybe Johan, if you want to talk about isolating the noise, and then Yemi, you can talk about proving protocol versus application.
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. And if you have like some issue and you want to perform a root cause analysis, I don't think isolating noise is something that's necessary. I think it's more important to have an aggregated view of everything that's happening on the infrastructure at a certain moment in time. And if you have like an aggregated view that shows both the resources that are being consumed on a host level, on a storage level, on a VM level, as well as your connection protocol metrics, then it's quite easy to see what the actual root cause of the issue is. And on average, connection protocol related settings are a great example of an issue that we see at a lot of customers, and that could be related to basically anything. It could be infrastructure related, it could be networking related, it could even be VM, so virtual desktop related, GPU related, and this is I'm making no jokes here. I even had a customer once that in which one of the persons from the senior management was working from home a lot, and always at certain moments in time at home he had connectivity issues, and his latency increased, and that was due to the fact that he was working quite close to the microwave, and every time he set up he turned on his microwave to, for instance, heat up milk or something else, his connectivity dropped, and we were able to find the root cause basically just by using a tool and monitoring his daily tasks and having those metrics next to what he was doing. So it's quite essential to have a tool like this in your IT infrastructure.
And I think that's a really good point, Johan. I think we hear those sort of things a lot. We had people that you know, walk away from their Wi-Fi routers or something like that, and then you see a direct correlation with the drop in connection speed and things like that. So to really sort of, I wanted to jump into the technology just a little bit to talk about, you know, that question where is it a protocol issue or an application issue. So within the protocol tab, whether it's blast or PC over IP in a user session, you can see the round trip time, but you can also see the available bandwidth. So in that case where they're you know, heating something up in the microwave, you would see a drop in connection speed, which will automatically correlate with a spike in round trip time, a spike in latency, so you know it's a issue with their connection speed rather than the application. However, there is a dedicated applications tab here at the top that goes over and shows all of the applications that are running inside of the VDI, resource utilization for those applications, as well as any processes inside of the VDI as well. So you could easily identify the root cause of issues, whether it's within the protocol or the network or the applications that are being run or utilized inside of the VDI sessions.
Great. Next question's a little timely on things that are going on. This person has, we have mandates for work from home with the coronavirus. Can your report show if our employees are actually working and logging in?
I think I'll take this one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's very current, and we get those questions at customers as well. So yeah, Yemi, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can pull up one of the sample reports here now. You know, we do have over 65 out-of-the-box alerts to be deployed into your environment. One of them is our end user activity report, and I know this one is, you know, it sort of has a big brother element to it. But here you can isolate a user. This is one for Citrix, but it works the same way for Horizon. You can isolate a user, and you can see not only the amount of sessions that they have in the environment or for a particular time period, but you can also see their active hours. This is the hours that they're actually generating traffic inside of their sessions. So, you know, it's one thing for a user to open up a VDI session. It's another thing for them to be doing something inside of their VDI session. So, this end user activity report is definitely very heavily used, especially in situations where you have a mobile workspace initiative or when you have contractors logging into the VDI environment to actually do some work. So that's something that it's pretty funny because you know, we hear about you know, HR and management really wanting to see some visibility into the usage, individual usage of the VDI.
Great. Next one, maybe Johan, you could talk to this and Yemi add on, but who are the typical users of a monitoring tool like this? And then kind of the follow-up for Yemi, how many people does it take to manage Goliath?
Right, yeah, so if you look at typical users, you have multiple of them and multiple types of people consuming or using an application like this. And I think one obviously is the IT technician that handles the phone. You know, they get called when an employee has a bad user experience, and with a tool like this, you're immediately able to see what's happening at the user side by looking at the metrics and able to solve the issue. I think another one is more or less from an SLA perspective. So an IT manager is quite easily able to see what the environment was doing for the last month or last 2 months or last couple of weeks, and easily able to see and to validate if the infrastructure was compliant to the agreed SLA. And I think the last one is, or the third one, has to do with sizing. So for instance, if an architect is sizing an infrastructure or sizing a new environment because of a lifecycle management operation, or because you want to scale out towards a cloud, based on the historical information, let's say over a whole year, And we see that at customers as well. We have some customers working in the travel business, and they have to scale up their users at a certain point in time, certain point in year. And they chose to do so in a public cloud instead of doing that on premises. And with a solution like this, an architect is quite easily able to see when in a year they had to scale out, and also include the right number of users. So it's really different types of roles that could easily benefit from the value add of your solution.
Perfect. And then maybe Yemi, could you talk?
To answer
yep.
that. Yeah, to answer that question specifically about what it takes or how many people it takes to manage the solution. It depends. What if we take one of our larger deployments? I think they're about 15,000 users or so. There's just there's one sort of dedicated individual that sort of manages and runs the technology. And he says that it takes up about a third of his time. So the technology is really stocked with embedded intelligence and alerts and giving you sort of insight into the environment right out of the box that you could sort of focus on other things, while the technology does most of the alerting, reporting, and enables you to do deep troubleshooting quickly when you need to. So, it really does depend on the environment, but, if you take a larger one, it's about a third of an individual's time.
And Yemi, to follow up on that, another question that came in is how difficult is Goliath to implement?
Implementation is fairly straightforward. The deployment of the technology, including the early warning system, takes about 90 minutes, an hour and a half, to actually have the technology deployed, and then the rest of the time we typically then use to train, go over some of the deep metrics that we collect, especially with the Logon process and some of the connection metrics that are typically a blind spot. So we really focus on implementing reports, setting up alerts, and tweaking those, and training our customers so that they're able to leverage the technology correctly. So on an implementation point of view, from just only the technology, it takes about 90 minutes.
Great. One last question, unless any others come in, and Yemi, this might be for you. This customer says they have VMware Horizon on-premise, which delivers our users Cerner Millennium, which is hosted on Citrix. Do you work in this kind of setup?
Oh, absolutely. That's one way that is that the technology is used, especially when we're talking about in a healthcare environment where there's a published VDI and then they use Citrix to access Cerner. Our technology is actually the only technology that's deployed in Cerner's remote hosted facility. So with the technology, you're able to see not only your on-premise Horizon sessions, but also the sessions from Cerner in that sort of what we call a double hop configuration. This is sort of objective evidence and true end-to-end visibility for those sort of sessions, so you can pinpoint exactly what's impacting performance in any element that actually impacts the VDI environment. So yes, we absolutely do work in those environments.
Well, great. Well, that is the end. I want to thank you again, Johan, for joining us. This was great feedback, a lot of great information being shared today. I do encourage anyone to go to the Goliath website and get VDI design book that Johan has authored for more information. And as you sign off, you will be prompted for that 4-question survey. We would love to hear your feedback from today's content and ensure that it aligns to your expectations. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.